My name is Margaret Turner, though most people call me Maggie. I was 65 the year my husband, Richard, died in a sudden car accident. After more than 4 decades of marriage, I believed his funeral would be a place of grief, of respect, of shared memories. Instead, it became the stage for the moment that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. The scent of lilies filled the chapel, along with the heavy silence of rain pressing against stained glass windows. I stood near the entrance wearing Richard's charcoal gray coat, the one he'd always said made me look dignified. Guests passed by, offering quiet condolences while I tried to hold myself steady. My only son, David, 33 years old and a software engineer, walked up to the podium to deliver his tribute. His voice was calm and measured, the way it always was when he wanted to sound professional. I waited, clutching my handbag, thinking maybe he would finally acknowledge me. His mother, the woman who stood behind his father for 40 years. But then his tone shifted after a pause that seemed to echo across the room. He said, "There is someone I want to thank, someone who was truly family to my father." I felt my breath catch. For one suspended second I thought he meant me. But no. His eyes turned toward the front row, where a woman in a fitted emerald dress sat with perfect posture and delicate tears glistening in her eyes. Catherine Doyle. The sound of her name spread like a ripple through the room. She stood, dabbing her cheeks, nodding gracefully as if she belonged there. My son's words hung in the air like a verdict. She supported my father through the hardest years of his life. In that moment, surrounded by mourners, I was no longer the wife. I was invisible. 2 days after the funeral, I walked into a downtown law office for the reading of the will. The building smelled faintly of old wood and polished brass. I sat at a long mahogany table, my hands folded tightly in my lap. My son David sat across from me, his expression steady, almost detached, as though this were a routine business meeting. The lawyer, a gray-haired man with a slow, deliberate voice, opened a folder. His words carried the weight of final judgment. Pursuant to the will signed by Mr. Richard Turner 3 years ago, the majority of his assets, including the primary residence in Vermont, the vacation home in Cape Cod, and the remaining balance of his accounts, shall be inherited by Miss Catherine Doyle. For a moment I thought I had misheard. My ears rang as though the walls themselves had collapsed. Catherine Doyle. Again that name. She wasn't his wife. She wasn't the mother of his child. And yet, she was the one who now held the keys to everything Richard and I had built over 40 years. I turned my eyes toward David, praying for shock, for anger, for some sign that this was as outrageous to him as it was to me. But his gaze stayed fixed forward, his posture rigid, his fingers clasped neatly on the table. He looked as though he had expected this all along. The lawyer continued, "Mrs. Margaret Turner is to receive a small trust of $5,000, designated as a gesture of acknowledgement." His voice echoed like a cruel joke. A gesture? After decades of sacrifice, my worth was measured in a token sum, smaller than what Richard once spent on a business weekend in Boston. When the reading ended, Catherine stood up gracefully, offered her hand to David, and smiled. My son rose without hesitation. They embraced as though the outcome were something to celebrate. I remained in my chair, unable to move. My marriage, my security, even my role as a mother felt as if they had been erased in one calculated stroke of ink. As I left the law office that day, the city outside looked different, as if the streets themselves no longer belonged to me. On the drive home, my mind slipped into memories of the life I thought I had lived. Richard and I met in our 20s. He was ambitious, confident, always dressed in sharp suits that made people take him seriously. I was a financial consultant at the same firm, and back then I carried myself with equal determination. We worked side by side in conference rooms filled with numbers and strategies, never imagining how uneven the balance of our lives would one day become. When David was born, Richard pressed me to leave my job. "You don't need to work," he had said. "I'll provide for us. Focus on the home." I resisted at first. I loved my career, the sense of independence, the thrill of being part of decisions that shaped the company. But I gave it up, believing I was choosing love and stability over ambition. What followed were decades of quiet sacrifice. I cooked meals late at night after long days of caring for David. I balanced the household budget to the last penny, even when Richard insisted we could spend freely. When David's tuition bills came due, I sold the emerald ring my mother had left me. A ring that carried generations of family history. Richard called it practical. Called it love. Our marriage wasn't filled with grand gestures, but I believed it was solid, like an old brick house weathered by storms. There were cracks, yes, but the structure seemed sound. We had traditions. Sunday dinners, Christmas mornings by the fireplace, quiet evenings where I brought him tea while he read the paper. Those rituals stitched together the fabric of our life. Yet beneath the surface, Richard had been pulling away. There were business trips that grew longer, late-night phone calls taken in another room, and moments when his eyes seemed fixed on a world that didn't include me. I chalked it up to stress, to the pressures of running a firm. I never let myself imagine another woman filling the spaces I thought belonged to me. Now looking back, I realized the truth had been unfolding for years, hidden in plain sight. And I had mistaken silence for loyalty, habit for love. In the weeks after the will reading, I drifted through the house like a shadow. Richard's clothes still hung neatly in the closet. His favorite cologne lingered faintly on the sleeves of his jackets, and the chair he always used at the dining table remained untouched. Yet, in those silent rooms, I began to notice traces of someone else. While cleaning out his desk, I discovered a slim folder tucked beneath old tax forms. Inside were letters from a property management company in Cape Cod. To my disbelief, the letters were addressed not to Richard, but to Catherine Doyle. They spoke of repairs, landscaping, and monthly fees, details I had once handled for our own home, but now tied to a house I had never even seen. My heart pounded as I read line after line. He had bought her a home, a sanctuary by the sea, while I pinched grocery budgets and stretched every dollar to cover David's education. I sat frozen, the papers trembling in my hands, feeling as though my entire marriage had been rewritten without me. Later that week, I visited my neighbor Helen Brooks. She had lived across the street for decades and carried the sharp memory of someone who had watched every season unfold on our block. When I mentioned Catherine's name, Helen's brow furrowed. "Oh, Catherine. Yes, I remember her. Richard took her to concerts more than once. And one Christmas when you were laid up with your knee, I saw her outside helping him put up the lights. I thought she was some cousin or relative." I forced a smile, though my throat was dry. In truth, I remembered that winter all too well. I had been upstairs with pain in my joints, and Richard assured me a neighborhood boy had lent him a hand. Now I knew it was Catherine, stepping into a role that was never hers to take. As Helen spoke, the weight of years collapsed on me. What I had dismissed as paranoia or imagination had been reality all along. Catherine had not simply appeared after Richard's death. She had been woven into our story for more than a decade. While I remained blind, I knew I had to speak with David. For days I rehearsed what I might say, turning sentences over in my head like stones in a river. Finally, I asked him to meet me at the cafe where he used to devour caramel desserts as a little boy. I thought the familiarity of the place might soften the distance that had grown between us. He arrived in a beige trench coat, his shoulders squared, his expression reserved. When he placed his phone face down on the table, I recognized the signal. Any call, any message could still take priority over me. "Why did you send Catherine a legal notice?" he asked before I even sat down. His voice was clipped, formal. "I sued her," I said. "Do you believe I shouldn't have? She took everything your father and I built together." David exhaled with irritation, as if my words were an inconvenience. "Dad gave it to her. It was his decision. Suing her just makes things uncomfortable for everyone." Uncomfortable. My voice cracked, a mix of disbelief and sorrow. "David, I gave up my career for this family. I sold my mother's emerald ring so you could finish college. Do you know what that ring meant to me?" He looked away, shaking his head. "You always bring it up like I owe you something." The word struck me harder than any shout could. I searched his face, hoping for a flicker of the boy I once knew, the child who clung to me during asthma attacks, the teenager who cried on my shoulder after his first heartbreak. But he was gone, replaced by a man standing firmly in his father's shadow. After a pause, he spoke again, quieter but no less cruel. "Dad said the happiest years of his life were with Catherine. She respected him. She didn't criticize him the way you did." My hands trembled around the coffee cup. I wanted to scream, to remind him that my questions were born from neglect, not malice. But all I could say was, I questioned him because I wanted him to respect me too. David only shook his head, closing the door between us with silence. That was the moment I realized I had not only lost my husband, but also my son. The night after meeting David, I sat alone at the kitchen table with a mug of cold tea. The silence of the house pressed in on me. For decades, I had defined myself as a wife and mother. Yet now both roles felt stripped away. I stared at the folder of documents I had found in Richard's desk. The property records tied to Catherine. The papers seemed to whisper that my life had been lived in shadows. I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. The grief was heavy, but beneath it, something else began to stir. Resolve. The next morning, I called an old friend from my consulting days, Ruth Coleman. She had been one of the few women in the firm who supported me when I decided to leave. Though semi-retired, Ruth still took on occasional cases, and she was known for her sharp memory and her refusal to look away from uncomfortable truths. "Ruth," I said, my voice steady despite the weight in my chest. "I need your help. I believe Richard used company funds to build a life with Catherine." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Ruth answered, "If that's true, it isn't just betrayal, Maggie. That's fraud." 2 days later, I drove to her home in the suburbs. The bungalow was modest, painted pale gray with chrysanthemums wilting by the porch. Inside, Ruth greeted me with her usual brisk warmth and a glass of lemon tea. She opened her laptop and pulled up archived payment records. Together, we combed through the files. Buried in spreadsheets were 3 large transfers labeled consulting support. The recipient company had no physical address, no website, nothing but a name that sounded professional enough to pass unnoticed. When Ruth highlighted the dates, my stomach twisted. One payment matched the month I had been recovering from surgery, lying in bed while Richard told me he was buried in work. Another coincided with the year David started college. Ruth looked at me over her glasses. "Do you really want to pursue this? It will be messy, painful." I straightened in my chair. For the first time in months, my voice carried certainty. "Yes, I want the truth. I have lived too long in the dark." Once I had the first thread of evidence in hand, I knew I needed someone who could weave it into a case strong enough to stand in court. Ruth gave me the name of an attorney she trusted, Michelle Reynolds, a seasoned lawyer in her mid-50s known for her calm precision. Walking into Michelle's office felt like stepping into a different world. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline, and shelves of leather-bound books lined the walls. Michelle herself greeted me with a firm handshake, her short hair neatly framing her face. Her presence radiated both warmth and authority. I handed her the folder I had assembled. Copies of property letters, transaction records Ruth had uncovered, and printouts from Catherine's public social media. In the photos, Richard appeared again and again, smiling in her garden, raising a glass at her holiday parties, even posing with David. Each image cut deeper than the last. Michelle studied the documents carefully. "These transfers," she said, tapping one page, "are suspicious. If your husband funneled company money into Catherine's name, we could argue misuse of corporate funds. That makes this more than a family dispute. It could be fraud." Her words steadied me. For the first time since Richard's death, I didn't feel powerless. I felt like a woman preparing for battle. Over the next few weeks, we gathered everything we could. Ruth tracked down additional financial statements that revealed over $300,000 funneled into a shell company tied to Catherine. Michelle requested expert analysis to prove the invoices were fabricated. Meanwhile, I cataloged every photo, every letter, every scrap of evidence that showed Richard had built a secret life with her. Nights once filled with grief now became nights of purpose. I sat at the dining table with files spread out around me, highlighter in hand, determination replacing despair. I was no longer simply the widow left behind. One evening, as I placed the final document into a binder, I whispered to myself, "You thought you erased me, Richard, but I'm still here, and this time I will not be invisible." The day of the trial arrived with a sky the color of slate, heavy clouds pressing low, as though the weather itself anticipated the weight of what was to come. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Michelle, my binder of evidence neatly stacked in front of me. Across the aisle, Catherine Doyle adjusted her pearl necklace, her lawyer whispering in her ear with a confidence that made my stomach tighten. The proceedings began with Catherine's attorney painting her as a loyal companion who had simply been compensated for consulting services. He held up a stack of invoices, claiming they were proof of legitimate work. From the outside, the papers looked professional, numbers, dates, signatures, but I knew every line was a fabrication. When it was our turn, Michelle stood with steady composure. She presented the financial records Ruth had uncovered. Transfers to a company with no office, no staff, no presence beyond a name on paper. She laid out the timeline, showing how each payment coincided with moments in my life when Richard had told me he was too busy, too burdened to be present. Then Michelle called me to the stand. My heart pounded as I swore to tell the truth. For a moment I feared my voice would falter. But when I began to speak, decades of silence broke open. I told the court about the 40 years of marriage, the sacrifices, the nights I stayed awake to care for Richard, the ring I sold to send David to college, the quiet ways I built the foundation of our home. I described the humiliation of sitting at his funeral, watching my son thank another woman as if I had never existed. As I spoke, I saw the judge's eyes soften. She was a woman in her 60s, her expression steady but not unfeeling. She listened as if she understood what it meant to be erased by someone you trusted most. Michelle presented the photographs one after another. Richard at Catherine's home, raising a toast, planting flowers, standing close with David by his side. The room grew quiet. Even Catherine's confidence began to crack as the evidence piled higher. After hours of testimony, the judge delivered her ruling. Her voice was firm, leaving no room for doubt. Catherine Doyle was ordered to return every cent Richard had funneled to her. Over $1 million, including interest. The gavel fell, and in that instant, the weight I had carried for months shifted. Justice at last had spoken. The ruling sent ripples through our town. Catherine was forced to sell the Cape Cod property and liquidate other assets to pay back the judgment. Her once polished reputation crumbled overnight. Invitations stopped arriving, colleagues distanced themselves, and eventually, she vanished from the social circles where she had once thrived. For me, the outcome was bittersweet. I had fought for justice and won, but the victory could not erase the hollow silence in my own home. David refused to speak to me. In his eyes, I had tarnished his father's memory and humiliated the woman he had chosen to defend. Weeks turned into months and months into years. The distance between us stretched like an endless road. Then one winter morning my father passed away. At his funeral, I stood near the casket, bracing myself for solitude. But when I looked up, I saw David standing at the back of the chapel. His face carried exhaustion but also something softer, something almost like regret. After the service, he approached me slowly, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry." The words hung in the cold air like fragile glass. We sat on a bench outside the chapel. For the first time in years, David asked questions not about the money, not about Catherine, but about me. I told him everything I had carried, the truths I had fought to prove. He listened, and gradually I saw the defenses he had built begin to fall. Our reconciliation was not immediate, but it was real. Step by step, we rebuilt what had been broken. And for the first time since Richard's death, I felt the faint warmth of family returning. Months later, on a quiet spring afternoon, I walked into my garden. The crabapple tree Richard and I had planted decades ago stood in full bloom. Just the year before, I had nearly cut it down, convinced it was dying. Yet here it was, branches heavy with blossoms, defying the harsh winters it had endured. I placed my hand on the rough bark and smiled. That tree was more than wood and leaves. It was a reminder that life can return where we least expect it. Some things that seem broken still have the strength to bloom again. My journey through grief, betrayal, and courtroom battles had left scars. But it also gave me clarity. For years, I measured my worth by how well I served others, my husband, my son, my home. I had mistaken sacrifice for love and silence for loyalty. Now I understood, strength is not about giving everything away. True strength is knowing when to hold something back for yourself. David and I still walk carefully around our shared past, but each conversation brings us closer. Forgiveness takes time, but so does growth. Like the tree, we both have roots deep enough to survive the storms. As I stood in the garden, I finally felt free. Not invisible, not erased, but alive in my own story. If this story touched you, please like, share, and leave a comment about where you are watching from. Your voice reminds me that even after silence, connection can bloom again.